our month of Ape Madness continues as we, this time on a remote island, an expedition finds a giant ape and bring it back to civilization. That's, of course, the story of King Kong. And I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds.
Hello, hello.
And this time around, the thing I found pretty much was a idea that we really see throughout this series is how much technology has made a difference for, storytelling. And, certainly we've covered this to a degree in some of the other movies and stuff, but I feel like, we really see that with the Kong series. I mean, it's just, we see it from the early beginnings with claymation and then, the kind of more live action, mechanical kind of technology and on into digital and more recently motion capture.
Yeah. I mean, the Kong movies are very telling of the advances that would be made in technology. And I mean, it's easy to look back on even the original and think, well, that's just quite laughably bad now. But right. I mean, you've got to remember, these were absolutely groundbreaking. For 1933, people were absolutely amazed by it. I'm not sure people were quite so amazed by the 1976 version. But I mean, certainly in its scope, the 2005 one was again kind of like a, building on Lord of the Rings, so much CGI from recreating the 30s to King Kong and all the monsters on Skull Island and things like this. So, I mean, huge jumps you can see that have been made in those movies.
And I think the thing, no matter what time period and what the technology is, it's as long as they're using it to really, kind of best tell a story and keep you involved in the world and stuff, to me, then the technology is doing its job. It's when it draws its attention to itself that's when it loses something and everything. And, you and I have talked about how, like, for example, in I Am Legend and stuff, the movie worked right up to when you started seeing kind of the glaring parts of the technology. It just took you right out of it. It was, you were very much in that kind of world until, like took you out of that world and stuff.
Yeah. And I think it's, I mean, for all of its sort of rudimentary technology, the 1933 one is at least a fairly fast-paced movie, and it doesn't sort of keep you waiting around too much. The effects in 76, we'll have to get to those, but I mean, they all, I mean, to varying degrees, they're there to sort of tell a story, but yes, some better than others. I'll leave it at that. But
so let's start with the 1933 one and stuff. And to me, it's interesting how that really is the first one that kind of focused on the key story of this idea of Beauty and the Beast. And it's certainly we have like kind of we're in the heart of the Depression era and stuff, and it's much easier to sell, I think, in that time period. You see quite a bit of desperation, so the idea of a woman kind of, basically being, told to basically drop her life and kind of jump on a ship, sailing away for like an unknown destination and stuff like that. It's pretty believable because like, certainly, like kind of, again, we just sense the fact that like people are just scrambling just to get a bite to eat, just to stay alive and stuff like that. So it just really fits that time period.
Yeah, and I think as well, I think Denham is very much a stand-in for Cooper, the real producer of the movie, and there's a guy who's desperate to make movies in whatever form, and in Cooper himself was trying to go to sort of various places. He went on a trip to Ethiopia before he made King Kong. And he's fairly accurately portrayed in as someone who will just sort of travel and try and exploit whoever he can for the sake of entertainment. I think he's pretty accurate in that respect.
There's some kind of fascination then with these jungle movies too. There's
totally,
something about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird how that was such a thing at that time. It was often, I guess it's sort of the idea of uncharted territory, which isn't really something these days. That even, everything is satellite mapped. They had that air of mystery, danger that just probably isn't really there anymore. Which is probably why we moved into science fiction, because that was another, unknown territory.
Right. And Ripley was pretty big at that time. I think, like he was another one that like was doing a lot of these expeditions and stuff. And I feel like part of it was, like kind of when they're here in the States, there was such a sense of, like they call it depression, right? For more than one reason, that like people really kind of, were down on luck and down on hope and everything. And there's this kind of escapism then maybe of like kind of, for your nickel, whatever, to kind of, forget about your troubles for a bit and kind of be transported to some other exotic land. I feel like that's part of the allure of like, just with these different adventurers and going, to some exotic place and stuff.
Well, I think that's it. I mean, it's in a way, I feel like King Kong, we've talked about this before, in that movies and culture often reflect a subconscious fear of what was happening at the time. And I mean, if you look at it from a sort of very sort of visual, symbolic sort of way, you have the crash of 1929, which was a huge uncontrollable force bringing down the city of Manhattan. And then, King Kong is like almost like a visual symbolization of that, and the terror that is then sort of like, meted out onto the people of New York. So I think there's definitely an element of that, in this idea of like this huge creature kind of destroying a city. It's almost like the pinnacle of our achievements as human beings being taken down by something very primitive. And so there's this kind of weird existential threat, or maybe a fear, a lack of control, that these things that are supposed to be organized and sort of orderly are actually, can be brought down with people's greed or their own kind of, baser instincts, we'll say.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a great part of it, is just this, like I said, a lack of control over, forces that, and certainly we see this with, as you said, Kong himself and stuff. Just even like when the, like the adventurers going to the island and stuff, they really realize that like, they're really out of their elements. I mean, I guess that's part of the idea too of, different times of, going somewhere, in an expedition, is the fact that like now all of a sudden you're no longer like all the trappings of civilization are kind of behind you, and like, back on the ship, or, never mind, like kind of, back home and stuff like that. And, you have your rifle and your wits, and that's really it.
Yeah, but I would say this is where we start getting into the rather dodgy areas with this movie. In that, if there's one message that the King Kong movies have, it's that indigenous people are dangerous and they will abduct your white women.
Right.
That seems to be like an overriding message. And it's only when we get to 2017 Skull Island that they stop being like a threat. Yeah. So, and I mean, also the fact that the natives, for whatever reason, seem to value white women over their own is very, very dodgy.
We'll trade you 6 of ours for one of yours.
Yeah, so there's, and the fact that Kong himself seems to prefer white women to the indigenous women as well is rather the dodgy ground. But I mean, in terms of, it's certainly not a feminist masterpiece by any stretch of the imagination, King Kong. I mean, there's, there's lines like Ann Darrow says, "Have I been trouble?" And, I think it's, the captain says, "Women can't help being a bother. It's just the way they're made." There's classic lines like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's funny though, like, Jack in this one is like very much this kind of like a pickup artist, right? Where on the one hand, he starts off, basically like negging this, like kind of girl of interest, right, and stuff. And then, but ironically though, like, at some point, he, I guess, develops an interest, and all of a sudden he professes his love. And, so it's kind of like, I don't know, like, to me, like kind of some of those lines almost seem to be written by like a, like a 10-year-old, boy or something like that. And it's kind of really, I kind of really question sometimes, like, what's called what the idea is in terms of how romance plays out in the 30s apparently.
Yeah, it's very strange, isn't it? It's kind of like you put a sort of a brave face in it, and then you sort of collapse, like a weakling, and the women is obviously just supposed to fall for you at that point or something.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing, of course, about this whole thing with the natives is that obviously it was completely. I think the most disturbing thing about the indigenous people thing is that it's obviously perfectly normal in society in 1933 to expect indigenous people to value white women more than any others, and they'll abduct them at any chance, and it's perfectly fine and understandable for I think the other thing is that they are shown as uncivilized, and that any indigenous culture is just portrayed as uncivilized, and that you should put white women on a pedestal is kind of the underlying message somewhere. That is what civilization is. You should go and take all your men and rescue white women and just kill as many indigenous people as possible. That's the right thing. That is what we're supposed to be doing in this movie. So it's weird that all of that is just through a sort of a more modern lens is completely sort of normal mindset in the 30s.
I started, when I thought more about that, because I had similar ideas, I started thinking that this is like the precursors for the Westerns and stuff, where instead of natives it becomes Indians and everything. So I started wondering then if there was some kind of thread to it. Certainly there's the exploitation aspect and everything, but part of it was I'm wondering if it was something more in the psyche of the West, where you have this kind of historic connection, right, where civilization was Western kind of society and stuff like that, and then you have the barbarians outside the gates and everything. And in other words, I think that was something that was maybe just kind of just always in the back of the minds of the people as they kind of moved more and more west and everything. It was always this idea that on the outside of the walls there's this kind of impending invasion by hordes, and they were going to, like you said, basically they want your white women and stuff, and maybe at one point it was the Huns, another time it was the Mongols, or on and on, stuff like that. And I feel like that's kind of almost like this, which is sometimes what myths do, is they become archetypes. They symbolize some kind of fear that kind of is basically ingrained, and kind of maybe through other stories and stuff like that just kind of is reinforcing and everything. And it's never really told literally, I think, but here is the story that kind of basically portrays kind of something that's there in the psyche and everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about this actually with the Red Dragon, and this idea of the kind of the noble savage, or the sort of the fear that the women will get abducted by the Native American Indians and go native, and this kind of thing. I think this is a kind of an adaptation of that kind of underlying fear that was there pretty much since settling in the States. I think it's similar sort of things. But I mean, of course, we are missing the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which people say, this is basically just like the subconscious fear of African-American people. And as a bit of background, at that time, you had Jack Johnson was the heavyweight champion for 7 years in a row. And he had a white wife. There were there were 6 race riots in various cities throughout the I think it was between the 20s and the 30s, and in the 20s anyway. So setting up before King Kong, there was a lot of tension there. And I think what you're seeing here is, if you look at it on a very basic level, they go to another country. This person's sort of desperately trying to sort of abduct white women, and then they chain him up, take him back to America to exploit him. It doesn't take a huge leap of imagination to see a subconscious fear of African Americans, and they're sort of starting to get more rights. They're unchained. And what will it do? Will it bring down society?
Right.
Cooper didn't say explicitly. I don't think you would be able to say explicitly that this was it. But I mean, it was obviously subconsciously there enough that not only did it affect the film, but also it was something that was to be afraid of and sold enough tickets to moviegoers to be a realistic fear. I mean, imagine not that they would have had a black leading lady in 1933 movie, but if you imagine, would King Kong have been as terrifying for people? Would it have done so as well if the leading lady was African American? Or, you know, there's or even in 1976, you know,
right.
You know, you can do that replacement, and it's maybe it's a bit more realistic then. But you know, there's a clear reason for that. And funnily enough, I was reading that apparently in Hollywood there was a thing with lighting where they would actually put more light on your leading ladies to make them look more lit up and bright and white. So, you know, it's yeah, definitely we're in different times in the 30s.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that, like, you know, no matter how much, you know, like, kind of, even if, like you said, you know, Cooper denied it, or any of the, you know, writers, or on and on, stuff like that. I mean, it's just something that, you know, like you said, it's really hard to kind of, you know, argue, like, kind of the symbolism and stuff like that, and just for that matter, like, kind of, you know, the reaction that it kind of evokes and everything like that. You know, like, we really, you know, like, Fay Wray, right, like, and stuff, as Ann Darrow, you know, basically, you know, the main thing she's there for is to, you know, show the or to kind of basically convey the horror, right, of what's happening stuff. But then what's interesting also is the transition at some point, which we'll see again and again in the future movies. At some point, you know, whether it's a Stockholm syndrome thing or whatever, that, like, basically she, like, no longer you know, fears, like, kind of, you know, Kong and stuff, and, you know, becomes very sympathetic. And so we, as an audience, sometimes also feel this kind of sympathy and stuff. And it almost, like, kind of in a way is a telling statement about how, on the one hand, you know, like, kind of, you know, if we're objective, we can say, like, oh, well, you know, it's making humans look like the monsters and stuff, and the things we've talked about before there. But the other, I think, too, is, like, it's also maybe, again, is another part of the fear that, like, you know, at some point, then we're no longer just even, you know, going to be fighting, you know, this domination, you know, like, kind of, you know, by a great ape, or, like, you know, like I said, the symbolic, you know, African male, stuff like that. But then they'll become our leaders, you know, heaven forbid, right, and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think Ann Darrow actually is where you find the relevancy in the different time periods for each of these movies. And her fears and how she sort of deals with that situation is very different in each of them. And actually, we could even talk as far as there's actually a musical on Broadway, which I didn't realize until I started reading about this today, which we'll get into. But yeah, they have Ann Darrow is an African American in that one, which is very interesting. And they actually do explicitly kind of tie together, you know, the slavery aspect with them sort of bringing Kong over, which is pretty interesting. Though it does have a kind of it feels a bit sort of like a superficial kind of layering on top of something that's already a well-established kind of movie, you know, trope. So I don't know, I'm a bit cynical about it, but yeah, an interesting change nonetheless. I mean, I think in the 1933, Ann Darrow's sole purpose really is just to be abducted and to scream a lot, and not much else really, it seems. So yeah, but I think in the 70s one in particular, her role changes quite dramatically, and I think in 2005 it does again. Because I actually think the 2005 one has quite a lot of subtext about show business in it.
Yeah, definitely.
But we'll get into that. But
so we talked a little bit about this kind of idea of the, you know, kind of the jungle films and stuff. It's interesting how there's one movie before this that, like, apparently was, you know, noteworthy. Ingagi, I think it's pronounced. But basically, you know, like, the producers of this one drew the conclusion that gorillas plus sexy women in peril equals enormous profits, because the movie before this was just that. It was actually it wasn't a white woman and stuff in that case. It was actually a more African kind of, you know, tribal woman, stuff like that. And then where somehow like the ape, mated with, like kind of that, woman and stuff like that. And that kind of created this controversy because, part of it too is like this is like pre-code, right, and stuff. So they were more able to get away with, kind of things of where, like kind of interracial, interspecies in that case and stuff like that is like not as taboo as like, after all these kind of standards that, and again, this is even before we came up with movie ratings and stuff like that. There was just this kind of like trend towards, like kind of the appeasing the morality police, I guess.
Yeah. That is interesting. I mean, I think the other thing I read was that The Most Dangerous Game was filmed almost like on the same set as King Kong, which is an interesting one in that you've got humans treating other humans like animals, or hunting them like animals in this. And this one, you've got sort of an animal that is kind of almost like a metaphor for how we treat humans. So it's a very weird pairing of movies. I mean, you could also say there is a kind of an anti-colonial message in a way in this movie.
Definitely.
Because if you think about it from the perspective of the indigenous people of the island, these guys rock up with guns, they kind of shoot anyone and everything, and then they go and steal their god and take it back to their country, and then the god wreaks sort of hell in the city. So it's almost like, if you're going to extract, taking things, you bring things over to America, you'll bring trouble with it. It's I think there's a sort of a weird kind of message there.
And it's funny how, I mean, that's not even like really a discussion, right? Like it's basically like you said, like kind of they're stealing the gods of a race and stuff like that. Like think about like the equivalent of like the closest thing would be like for some kind of alien race, right, to come and steal our leaders and stuff like that, like the queen, or the president and stuff,
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
It's basically like you said, like kind of they're stealing the gods of a race and stuff like that. Like think about like the equivalent of like the closest thing would be like for some kind of alien race, right, to come and steal our leaders and stuff like that, like the queen, or the president and stuff, and go, like kind of rah, we got their kind of their leader and everything. And
it's kind of a bit like Bill and Ted. The closest thing I can think of.
Right. And it's just like you said, it's very much captures the colonial sense of entitlement that like we can just go to any primitive society and take what we want and stuff, and it's our divine right, or it's like kind of our manifest destiny.
Yeah. And unlike, say, a movie like Zulu, the indigenous people, the first sign of a gunfire, and they all sort of scatter and run. They don't seem to put up any fight, which sort of implies that firearms or how we empower ourselves and go and take over these countries and stuff. So I mean, I did think as well. The other interesting thing for me is like, and I think it's ironic that there's now a musical on Broadway of King Kong, but I don't think it's any coincidence that King Kong is brought back and made into a show on Broadway, because again, it's kind of like this sort of legacy of African Americans being seen as entertainment, so to speak, and I think there's definitely that kind of parallel there. It definitely corresponds to something that I think that would be in the consciousness of your white movie-going audience at the time, I'd say.
Yeah, and that's another great point too. I'm kind of curious at that. But I'm guessing I know the answer that like back then, right? Like your typical moviegoer, I mean, I don't see like kind of that being as much of an issue like somewhere like New York and stuff, where it's more cosmopolitan and stuff. But I'm guessing though that like in the South, like kind of you basically had your white theaters and and then there's probably no theaters even for your average African American. They probably had to like in the back room like somehow get a copy and stuff. And And yeah, I mean, I think it's just very much like you said. It was very much the audience, like kind of there was no demographics per se back then. It's probably like if you went to a movie, it was just basically understood that it was going to be pretty much the white audience and stuff.
Yeah, I think there's the other thing that's interesting for me is looking at in terms of Kong as a character. In that he starts off as like this sort of wild and untamed sort of animal, and the implication is that as he gets introduced to the society, he becomes more sort of civilized, in that he's sort of trying to, in a way, protect Ann Darrow. So that's almost like this kind of subtext that like he's becoming more human as the movie goes. But what does he do? He then sacrifices his life to protect the white person. It's almost by becoming more civilized, you're now understanding our hierarchy. I wonder if it's almost there's sort of some sort of thing there, and I mean, yeah. And
the other side of that though is the which is kind of probably why feminists nowadays have such an issue with the Beauty and Beast story in itself. There's this idea that like this male abusive kind of violent being and stuff like that has his way kind of basically rampages whatever stuff like that, but kind of as long as kind of you stay with them, they'll kind of eventually become more noble and more gentle and stuff like that.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, yeah, that is often that is the kind of the message in Beauty and the Beast, isn't it? It's just like women are the kind of the humanizing and civilizing force on these beasts, on men in a way.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And you kind of, it's very subtle in this. It's not really. But yeah.
Because it's more, like kind of, we talked about race, but also is like kind of the animal beast kind of thing, like literal beast and everything like that, versus like, when at some point we'll cover the Beauty and Beast kind of story, like the Disney sort of stuff like that. But that'll definitely get more into that kind of, more elemental idea that like, that it's the stuff that like kind of really implants the message, right? That, the male abuser is okay because deep down is very gentle human. He's a prince and stuff, and at some point the prince will be unlocked by the magic of their love. Again, I mean it's just right. It's a very troubling message.
It is. Yeah. Yes, God bless Disney.
So we'll save that for another time. But the other thing
I just wanted to.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, go on. I was going to say, well, there was one sort of. So people often ask Cooper whether this was, whether there was a sort of an undercurrent of race in the story, and he posthumously gave an interview saying, as he was the reason he did, and he had that striking image of King Kong on Empire State Building, is that as he was leaving his office in Manhattan, he heard the sound of an airplane engine. He reflexively looked up and saw the sun glinting off the wings of a plane flying too close to the tallest building. He realized that if he placed a gorilla on top of the tallest building and had him shot down by the most advanced weapons of the time, which was planes with guns on them, he would have a story of something primitive doomed by modern civilization.
Yeah.
Or so that, according to him, was his kind of main message. But I don't know. And apparently, he only included the woman to appease the critics that thought that he neglected romance in his stories. So it's funny because in a way, if you had King Kong without Ann Darrow in it, what sort of movie would that be? It would kind of be. Right. I think it would actually have been kind of much more forgotten. It would have been like a lot of the other kind of jungle movies that were around at that time, perhaps. But yeah,
and so I think I was going to say though that like one of the things though, like going back to some of the things that's like kind of the time period and stuff is like when we finally Kong is like kind of put on show, right, and stuff, and like kind of we see the crowds and we hear like kind of things about the people talking about the ticket costing them $20 and like kind of that like making money, right, is more of a joke in this kind of situation and stuff like that, where the kind of even the title of hero is kind of passed around between like Jack and then and Jack's like, I'm not the hero, it's Carl, and Carl Denham's like kind of like, oh, I'm not the hero, it's Anne, like kind of. So it's this funny kind of dynamic that I don't know. It's a little bit of showing also like kind of just the attitudes at the time of like between like kind of money and media and just it's something unique, I think, to that time period.
Yeah, absolutely. Can't remember what I was going to say now, but yes, it was definitely an interesting time, no doubt. So should we then move on to what I would describe as Sexy Kong, or the 1970s, 1976 version of King Kong?
I just want, before we do that, I just want to say one last thing though was, like it's interesting how we'll see this echoed also in the, the remake where they kind of recreate 1933, is where Denham says, like somebody says, planes killed the beast and stuff. And, Denham says, like, oh no, it's beauty that killed the beast. And so it echoes like kind of, what we said was this kind of the theme of it. But what's funny to me though is that like it's even more ironic that he says it, because actually, Carl, you killed him because of your greed and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh yeah, no, I mean Carl is the real bad guy. There's no doubt about it in it, and he just sort of, and it's kind of better expressed, I think, in the 2005 version. But he not only just sort of like kills loads of indigenous people, takes their god, endangers everyone on the trip, and then just brings it to New York and then kills loads more people, and all in the name of greed, really. So yeah.
And in a typical Hollywood movie, Denham would not have lived. Like, as a villain, he was doomed to be kind of either struck down by Kong or something like that. So it's interesting that he lives though, which I think is also like a statement of, modern capitalism, that like, you can kind of lay waste and kind of, doom other people and stuff like that. But in the end, you may just end up walking scot-free and stuff.
Yeah, it's very true. Yeah, and I would say any movie in the last 30 or 40 years, he would definitely have got it. And it's interesting. And it's probably just a result of Cooper just deciding as a producer he didn't want his character that he associated with to die in the movie.
Oh, of course not.
I'm guessing. Yeah, interesting. So, I think...
So the next one is, in 76 is produced by Dino De Laurentiis, who he, like it's amazing the amount of remakes that he's been responsible for that we've both covered and will still be covering in the future and stuff.
So Dino De Laurentiis is one of those characters that's really interesting for me in Hollywood, because there's a lot of movies that when I think back, I think, oh yeah, that was a memorable movie. And I think, oh, it was a Dino De Laurentiis one. And I think the main reason that I remember so many Dino De Laurentiis movies is that he somehow manages to crowbar in quite sexy scenes into family-rated movies somehow. Like, I mean, if you think about Flash Gordon, Princess Ardala is pretty much a sex kitten in that movie, and that's like a PG. So there's a lot of movies that he's done where I'm just like, oh yeah, that's why I remember the Dino De Laurentiis version. So
yeah, and it's brilliant when you think about it, because between the adults, right, the dads kind of taking the kids and stuff like that, then you have young prepubescent boys who are attracted to movies like Flash Gordon and everything, right? And meanwhile, they're just like, they don't even know what they're watching, like they know that like there's something interesting going on, but it's still this kind of this mystery that their hormones are about to kind of reveal to them.
I know, right? Yeah, it's just funny. I mean, I actually had real high hopes for this one because it has music by John Barry, one of my favorite soundtrack Johns. And but I don't think, but his soundtrack was very loungy and relaxing. It was perhaps a little too relaxing, I would say, for a movie about King Kong.
You felt like it was a James Bond kind of like, feel of where you're in the tropical islands again and everything, right? Like it had very much like kind of, like typical when James is like kind of in like Bermuda or wherever, stuff like that, like kind of, like kind of has that the strains of the violin, you know, like kind of as we're kind of maybe descending on some aerial scene or anything. And just had that kind of vibe throughout.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I would say it was James Bond on holiday, really. So yeah, I think we had René Auberjonois on one of his very few movie roles, which was kind of interesting to see, especially as kind of a young actor in this one. And of course, Jessica Lange's first movie role, which was really interesting. Now, this is where I think it sort of gets interesting for me, in that she seems to have spent most of the movie kind of heavily sort of breathing or in the throes of what seems to be sort of ecstasy half the way through, you know, the movie, either in the clutches of various sorts of Kong or other men and things like this. But interestingly, there's this weird kind of thing of anti-male chauvinism in her character, because the only reason she survives is because the men that she's on the yacht with are watching Deep Throat, and she decides to go on deck, and they all drown, and she survives. And then later on, she actually calls Kong a chauvinist, which was a really sort of weird sort of thing to put in. But I mean, yeah, she's very breathy, and she almost sort of gets drugged, like date rape drugged by the natives, it seems, and doesn't seem to be too bothered by it. She seems to kind of enjoy the whole ceremony. There's a lot of pelvic thrusting going on and things like this. It's it's quite an experience.
And she's quite the actress too. Like, we don't see it in this movie and everything like that. So
No,
it's interesting how,
don't.
you know, like kind of, you know, like she's clearly hired for her looks in this one, and to wear these skimpy outfits, and you know, basically like I mean, let's face it, she's eye candy in this movie and stuff like that. And that's clear. But it's interesting how, like, despite that, you know, she goes on to like a pretty, like, I mean, more than respectable career. Like, I mean, you know, I'm a fan of Tootsie and kind of just some of the other work that she did, you know, later on, where she's definitely, you see a lot more of her, like, what's called, her doing something that, like, you know, shows her abilities, I guess, beyond like kind of, you know, her physical attractiveness.
Yeah, I mean, I think she does add a kind of an interesting sort of character break, kind of subtlety, in that when she is actually abducted by Kong, and she does stand up to him, and she calls him a chauvinist and things. It is a kind of a weird. It's almost like you feel like she's having some kind of psychological break almost at that point. But she sort of stops playing the victim quite so much, which is pretty interesting. But this is where I kind of think it's almost like, because of course she is an actress in this movie, just like Ann Darrow and all the others, and I almost start feeling like this is becoming almost a comment on show business, in that you have to deal with these kind of, you know, guerrilla-like sort of studio producers, and you have to sort of kowtow to their demands. Probably in the 70s you do anyway, but you have to kind of also somewhere kind of like put the brakes on and have your own kind of defend yourself in some respects. So I think it's kind of very subtle in this one, but I think really in the 2005 one, it's much more more of a message. And
yeah, I mean, you know, just like you said, with like kind of her, like, you know, basically surviving because she refuses to watch Deep Throat with the, you know, kind of the other people in that boat and stuff. I think it just kind of goes along with this idea that, like, she on one hand appears kind of pretty ditzy, like pretty much like kind of, you know, like what you would expect to be like a very much a, you know, airheaded, you know, kind of actress and stuff. But like you said, at the same time, she has this part of her that, like, buckles down and like, you know, realizes that, like, nobody's going to really save her per se. Or for that matter, that she's not going to just wait around to be saved and stuff like that. You know, even though, like, ultimately that is what happens and stuff, and each of these versions of Kong, which is kind of funny. But she does, like, kind of stand up to Kong, though, as you said, and you know, like, that's something that, like, also we see even with, like, you know, Jeff Bridges, right? Which here in this case, it's no longer, you know, Jack what's called the Jack in this case is it's interesting how he's no longer part of the crew. If anything, he's kind of this environmental rebel and stuff like that. and symbolizing the kind of environmental theme that we'll see throughout this version and everything.
I would. Yeah, definitely. There's. I mean, I still feel the environmental theme is kind of crowbarred into this a little bit through Jeff Bridges' character. But I mean, yeah, he's kind of like the woke scientist. It's a kind of a precursor of the Jurassic Park Jeff Goldblum character, in that he already knows everything that's going to go wrong before it happens. He's like, I already know there's a secret monkey on this island, and I also know that if you go there and you try and extract oil, it's going to be a complete disaster and it's all going to go horribly wrong. So you're supposed to identify him as being the smart character,
right?
But also he also looks kind of like an ape in it. He's got kind of a nice long beard, and long hair and stuff. But yeah, and also he's doing some serious product placement as well. He's got like he's wearing a Rolex Submariner. He's got a Nikon camera. He's pretty well kitted out for a this kind of hippie. Rebellious hippie. He's doing pretty good somewhere. So that was kind of interesting. But an early role for him, really. Not. I think he did maybe. Starman's 80s, isn't it? Wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this is of course way before kind of we talked about him in True Grit. So this is many years early on in his career before that, and
And getting back to, I was just going to say, about some of the visual symbolism in this movie is very, very strong. In that you've got, they say that basically the gate, the natives sort of pushing down Ann Darrow through the gate kind of symbolizes penetrative sex in the Kong movies. It's like, okay, it's time to go for it now. And this is even more obvious in the Dino De Laurentiis version, because you've got these large timbers kind of sliding into sort of holes to lock the gate and things like this. And then also you've got this, the thing is, so that, of course, again, the thing that's pretty funny about this movie is that it is basically a guy in a monkey suit. And
right.
We're seeing this, strolling around through pine trees. But the weird thing for me in this one is you often get these close-ups of Kong's eyes being very real, and it looks even more like a guy in a monkey suit, looking kind of creepy. And there's this scene where he's there kind of trying to pull off the clothing of Ann Darrow, and you're seeing it from his eyes all close up, and he's like this, and you think this is like some weird voyeuristic kind of role playing going on between the viewer and it's almost like you're expected to be Kong there trying to get Jessica Lange's clothes off. It's a very sort of interesting movie in that respect.
Definitely. And I feel like what is being a little bit reflected, besides the kind of use of practical effects, is the time period where I remember like quite a few monster movies in the kind of, especially coming out of Japan during this time. And I think that was like kind of just really just part of like kind of the whole, I don't know, I guess I don't even know if you call it like a golden age or whatever, but for monster movies. But that was like I feel like that was a huge thing during that time. Like kind of like even before there's even this term of kaiju and stuff like that. At least that we're aware of in the West. And I think that's kind of like what. So in other words, just the idea of a guy in a suit. Maybe in American theaters is kind of considered like still something really, strange and stuff like that. But I think like kind of, it's just something that was just, during this time, and I think we'll see this more in the Godzilla series and stuff, that it just was a thing, I guess.
Well, I think the parallel to look at there between both of those is that I don't think it's any coincidence that King Kong came right after the Great Depression, and Godzilla came right after World War II. These are both kind of expressions of subconscious fear of large things that you can't control coming in and changing life in catastrophic ways, basically. Yeah,
and Godzilla is the source of his power is from nuclear, energy and everything. So that's definitely that's another huge part about it. Is this it echoes like like you said, what was the source of the fear, right? When you had a multi-megaton bomb being dropped on your country and stuff.
Yeah. The other line I really liked in the 70s version was that Jeff Bridges at one point says, "Who do you who do you think went through there? Some guy in an ape suit? And I thought, that's pretty ballsy for the production team to include that as a line when it's literally a guy in an ape suit. But
yeah, it's funny how we, in the Planet of the Apes, we even talked about how, in this one, Rick Baker, wanted to make up for what he had done. And what's called, in this one, he, I guess, for some reason, like, it was kind of a bit of a rush job and everything. I'm not even sure, like, kind of the full story about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's apparently because Kong is sort of like visually represented in two ways: either a guy in a suit or like this huge mechanical hand that's kind of grabbing hold of Jessica Lange. And apparently that hand didn't last very long; it broke down loads of times, so they could only use it in a few shots. But that was the way to sort of indicate to the audience, hey, it's not really a guy in a suit. But it's but they do. The interesting thing is this one, they're trying again to humanize Kong and make him seem like this gentle creature. And it's kind of, although it is the kind of Stockholm syndrome that's making Ann Darrow try to sort of be nice to Kong or telling people to protect him. But there is like the overriding sort of environmental message of you shouldn't sort of basically just take him out of his environment, and it's a terrible thing to kill this creature. But I would say the real message of this movie is actually, it kind of reads almost like a crisis of male identity, in that you've sort of got, in some respects, there's like the old sort of idea of what it's to be a man is kind of like Kong, and the new idea of the man is like more like the Jeff Bridges kind of character. I think there's kind of like this. I think it's a statement on how sort of women are navigating these kind of two different ideas of what it is to be a man. That was kind of what I got out of it.
Yeah, that's a great point. That it was probably after the 60s, right, that we started kind of seeing kind of the rise of this kind of more sensitive guy and stuff like that. Because, like you said, Jeff Bridges clearly, embodies those kind of hippie values that, like, on one hand, he's, basically, sensitive and kind of really, really intelligent or anything like that. But the other, he doesn't like, fall with the, he doesn't toe the party line, right? He doesn't believe in capitalism and the being like a corporate monkey and stuff like that. I mean, we see that over and over again, that he refuses to wear, like kind of a suit or, and even though like they try to make him part of the entourage and the entertainment or like that, he refuses to and everything. And then major kind of symbolism is like kind of having the oil branding for everything for the show and stuff like that, and basically of course Kong ripping that, so yeah, I mean, I can totally see how that's like basically showing how like the modern male just won't be stand for being like kind of a corporate puppet and stuff.
Absolutely. And I mean, if you think about it, Jeff Bridges' career has been he has been like the kind of anti-establishment kind of rebel character in loads and loads of movies. Or the Big Lebowski, I would say his character is Floyd, and in Tron is the same kind of character, really.
Right.
He's the kind of hacker dude and who owns an arcade. It's the same kind of thing. That is kind of like the niche he's carved out for himself as a.
Just one last thing I wanted to kind of mention before we kind of move on to the 2005 version is towards the ending of the 76, and I thought that like what was a telling statement about an idea that we kind of touched on, I think, a little bit, is, and I think you mentioned about how we see like the idea of, through, in this case, Jessica Lange's character, where it's basically, she's kind of like, has this dream of stardom and stuff. And basically, what we're really more or less told is like kind of, the need to basically, be, as we kind of covered in some other episodes, be at the beck and call of the public and stuff. It's something that we touched on in The Star is Born, where then you're no longer, like once you become a celebrity, you're basically owned by the public and stuff like that. And, they each, basically have access to a piece of you. And we see as they're kind of, in that moment where typically the hero and the heroine, right, like kind of join back together and embrace and whatever. They, they're kind of like kept apart by the crowd. And we've seen Jeff Bridges that he just basically like kind of just shakes his head that he's not going there or stuff like that. It's kind of a little bit depressing actually of an ending. Besides, of course, getting killed and stuff.
Yeah, and I should also sort of like elaborate a little bit on the whole close up of the eyes of Kong as well, because as well as this kind of creepy voyeuristic thing, it's also used or the intention anyway. I don't know how effective it is, but the intention is that you're supposed to empathize with Kong's plight much more in the 76 version, whereas in 33 it was just an out and out kind of action movie. This one you're actually trying to identify with the cruelty that's kind of being imposed on him some more, which is then expanded in the next version, I guess, 2005.
And then sorry, one last thing. Was the Twin Towers, like how the kind of twist that the De Laurentis version had to make was, instead of the Empire State Building, a more modern take of it was having Twin Towers and stuff, which, as we of course know, like kind of is now and interesting how that's now I don't even know what to call it, a relic or a memory, I guess, or because of course 9/11 and stuff. Yeah,
I mean, I'm sure oil companies involved, Twin Towers, it's conspiracy theorists, alarm bells will be ringing in their heads on watching the end of that movie. But I didn't really notice that. I guess I just kind of got bored of the movie by the end of it, so I completely missed that. But yeah.
So on to 2005, where we have Peter Jackson's version